Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. Last year, during Fraud Prevention Month, we talked and had a webinar about card not present fraud, the e-commerce channel, and how you can better manage fraud within that channel and protect yourself. This year, we're going to try to focus back to basics, more about the card present channel, what we're still seeing as we've evolved to chip within our market. A little bit about myself, as mentioned. Been with Visa 17 years. My role within risk services is really the client-facing aspect, working with either the issuers of cards, the acquirers like Moneris, or the merchants themselves on helping them manage and improve their fraud performance. So overall here, I've got a couple legal things I just have to talk about first. Third-party mark notice that you may see throughout here. And lastly, a copyright notice that this is Visa copyrighted material. And as for the agenda, I got a very robust agenda here, and I'm hoping to cover all this material today. There's a lot to cover. We're going to overview the fraud landscape, talk about proper card acceptance, contactless transactions, fallback, and what I mean by that, when a chip card doesn't work and it falls back to either mag stripe or key entry, forced posting, terminal security and tampering, data breach trends that we're seeing, small merchant data security best practices, a little bit at the end there about our Visa strategy, and I'll just sum everything up at the end. So overall, our fraud landscape within Canada, we're seeing four areas that tend to be the key areas of focus. The first is data security. Data compromise are still top of mind within the entire payment industry, and we've seen the number of data increase. You hear a lot of when the large retailers are breached within the market, but there's still a lot of emphasis around data breaches and security with an emphasis on cyber security and cyber intelligence. We're doing more within our Visa ourselves to gather some of this information. I'll talk a bit more about it, but how we're trying to identify from the data that's out there before a breach is actually even successfully exploited within the market. Fraud trends, we're seeing our fraud shift. As we've been almost 7 or 8 years into our chip migration now, there has been a shift from the card present to the card not present, which tends to be almost 80% of our fraud today. But we still see fraud being exploited within the card present space. Merchants, they will try to look for low-hanging fruit. They'll look for merchants that are not following proper card acceptance procedures, and they'll try to exploit it. But card not present is disproportionately high within our market. When we look at new players within our ecosystem, it's no longer a traditional four-party model. When I say that, that used to be an issuer, a cardholder, an acquirer, and a merchant. Today, it goes way beyond that. There's other entities that are now touching payments or involved in the payment process. All of these new entities bring huge opportunity to both the consumer and the issuers and acquirers and merchants, but at the same time they introduce new risks, because what we're seeing is there's new opportunity where data now is flowing through a new player, and can that data be compromised during that transaction flow. And lastly, regulatory attention. Governments are paying more and more attention to the payment industry, looking at consumer protection around their personal information, and how are you safeguarding that as a merchant, how are you safeguarding that as an acquirer, how is Visa safeguarding it overall. And then we look for opportunities in how we can collaborate with the public and the industry on better sharing of information or payment security trends and practices. When we look overall, despite all these trends that we're seeing, our fraud remains historically low. When we measure fraud, we measure it from a fraud to sales ratio. How much fraud does it represent of an overall portion of our sales? And right now we've been consistently hovering around 7 basis points. And what that means is 7 cents of every $100 is turning out to be fraud. And that's despite all the data breaches that you've seen over the years. And yet, during this period of time, we consistently are evolving and advancing our security and our defenses, whether it be through the payment card industry standards, whether it be machine learning and scoring and analytics, or just cyber threat intelligence. We're looking always forward as to how we further secure the industry to maintain these low fraud rates globally. When we look at how our fraud has shifted, this pattern is consistent with Canada, but also globally. In 2006, counterfeit represented 32% of our fraud globally. Card not present, which is the e-commerce, mail order, telephone, represented about 35%, and all the other fraud types, which would be lost, stolen, account takeovers, false apps, represented about 35%. If we fast forward here into 2016, what we see now is that counterfeit is a less of our portion. It's 27%, but our lion's share of our fraud now is within the card not present channel. 57% globally of our fraud is card not present. I'm going to give you a little bit of a Canadian perspective. These numbers, we haven't refreshed for 2017 yet. They still reflect 2016, but it's significant. This is the Canadian market, and Canadian credit card fraud continues to increase year over year. I think we're going to see a decline in 2017. But we looked at these numbers, it's $936 million in losses by Visa, MasterCard, and Amex in 2016. It grew by 29% over the previous year. This is a significant amount of money, and I always look at it from my previous background. It's foundation or seed money used by organized crime to facilitate. They're responsible for this type of activity, and then they use this to facilitate other criminal activities they're involved in. When you look further on this, we can look at counterfeit, and you can see that counterfeit actually grew overall, but the blue represents on this bar counterfeit within the Canadian market, and this is the impact that the chip and pin within our market has had on a reduction in counterfeit. But as I mentioned, fraudsters are very adaptive. They will move to other fraud types, to other fraud regions. And what we saw on Canadian cards was that our fraud moved south of the border to the U.S. at the time, which was not chip enabled. They were strictly a magstripe market. So that yellow represents cross-border counterfeit, and where issuers were being hit by cross-border trends. What you're going to see is a significant reduction in that in this upcoming year because of the U.S. is about 2 years into the EMV migration right now. And then the last is the card not present channel. And we talk about this as to how it's grown. It was now $680 million in 2016, and you can see that the line, it's a steady increase year over year to this particular channel. Again, I think due to the efforts of our issuers and being more aggressive on fraud strategies, we're going to see a decline in 2017 in this particular category. When we look at Canadian fraud, just to give you a perspective, this is Visa numbers in 2011, and I picked 2011 because that was when we had the migration to chip and our chip liability. Card not present was 63% of our fraud, counterfeit 19%. Fast forward to 2016, it's now sitting at 76%, 8% is card not present and counterfeit. Has been reduced slightly to 17% of the overall fraud. Remember, that is both domestic and cross-border. So if I was to look at the domestic only, you're going to see a much more significant reduction in that. But what is being missed here is what's the impact, and the impact on approvals. In the card present space, our approvals are pretty high. Domestically, about 98% of our transactions are approved because issuers have a lot of confidence in a chip and PIN transaction at the point of sale. It's something that's very difficult and almost impossible to compromise, and the PIN is something else, an added cardholder verification method. Cross-border, it's a little less at 91%, but we were also dealing with the U.S. market. It's probably half of them at that time was still magstripe. Card not present is another challenge because 87% of our overall card not present volume approval rate is much less than card present. So that's a lost opportunity. Issuers are trying to manage fraud with aggressive strategies, merchants as well in some cases as well too, and you're going to be impacting good cardholders to try to catch some of that fraud. So that's one of the consequences of trying to have an effective fraud strategy within that space. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about card acceptance. First of all, many may not be totally familiar with Visa. A lot of times, whenever someone has a problem with their card, they'll say it's a Visa card. But again, we're not a bank. We don't issue cards We're really at the center of one of the most sophisticated open commerce networks, and we pioneered electronic payments even back when cards were printed on cardboard. It all started in California back in 1958, and today we have more than 1,600 financial institutions in more than 200 countries and territories around the world, tens of millions of merchant locations, and more than 3 billion cards and accounts. And we're enabling this level of growth that also is going to require new ways to secure payments. So we also enabled real-time risk management. In the 70s, we introduced the first electronic authorization system that used telephone lines to connect merchants. In the past, it was all paper-based, but allowed them to connect merchants and enable banks to see transactions as they were happening in real time. And that advancement was really a game changer because it allowed us to bring intelligence into the network to every merchant terminal as we saw transactions in real time. When it comes to card design, again, most of this should be commonplace for a lot of merchants because you're also a card holder too, so you carry the cards around with you in your wallets. But there's a number of security features that are on the card that are evident and some that may not be evident, whether it be the hologram, the mini hologram dove on the back of the card, the signature panel, the 3-digit CVV2 code or card verification value code on the back of the card. And on the front you have the embossed characters. Underneath the embossed characters you're going to have a 4-digit pre-printed BIN, bank identification number, that should match the first 4 digits of that embossed character. An expiry date, the Visa logo on the front, but under ultraviolet lights you're also going to see an ultraviolet V, so that's not evident to the naked eye. And then there's also a contact chip or the contact symbol on it. Anybody that conducts transactions should be aware of these features and what's on a card. The challenge is, as we're in the chip environment today, you don't have that opportunity in a lot of cases to examine the card. It's when the card may fall back to other forms of payment acceptance, whether it be mag stripe or key entry, when you should be focusing on these key merchant security features. When we look at illustrated card acceptance, it's pretty straightforward. Either the cardholder is going to dip the card in for a chip transaction into the reader, or they're going to tap their contactless card when we're talking about a chip card acceptance. And then you're going to follow the prompts. The cardholder will, to complete the transaction. If the transaction has been PIN verified, there's no need for signature. U.S. cards today are issued as chip and signature for the most part. So you operate in this space, a signature line will pop up, and there'll be a requirement for you to capture signature, at least for now. That's changing in the next little while, and I'll mention something about that later on. And then if there is a requirement to print, then you just print it and you retain that copy. An effective point-of-sale strategy for merchants, there's going to be situations where your card being presented, the chip doesn't read, for example, or you're going to have mag stripe only cards that are presented. Prepaid, for example, is one that we see a lot of that are still mag stripe. Fraudsters are sometimes taking these cards and re-encoding the mag stripe, so they're still presenting you a genuine piece of plastic, but the mag stripe information is different. And this is now you have an opportunity to examine this card. You should be holding on to this card in this position and follow some proper card acceptance. And the biggest thing that you can do is look, when you're dealing with a mag stripe only transaction, is look at the last 4 digits on the card and compare it to the last 4 digits on your receipt that's being printed up. You will have the start of the card in most cases, you'll have a series of X's, and then you'll have the last 4 digits. That information on the mag stripe should correspond to what's embossed on the front of the card. Fraudsters are lazy. They won't re-emboss the card because it makes it real evident that it's been tampered with. They'll just change the mag stripe data. So what you should be doing is looking at that very carefully, comparing it. If you need to, then check ID, look at how often that card's been used at your location, just sort of velocity checks. But in that situation, if you discover something like this, then follow the procedures that you have in the store. We don't want to see anybody put themselves at risk, but you're just not going to accept that form of payment. That card is not a valid card, and whatever process has been set up by your individual store location or your management, follow those when you suspect this to be a fraud case. But most important thing is don't put yourself at risk. On contactless transactions, what we see here is mag stripe versus dynamic EMV chip. So there's different ways that we can look at contactless today. The first generation of contactless that were introduced in the market probably 8-9 years ago were based on MSD, mag stripe data equivalent. They were static. It was basically static data that was put into a contactless mode and captured. As we go forward here, now we also have contact chip data that takes place today, where you insert the card. That is a dynamic transaction. Each transaction is going to generate a cryptogram unique to that transaction. And that's where we have so much confidence in the transaction that we can see that that is the card that was issued by the issuer. It's communicating, when it's in that contact inserted in the terminal, it's communicating with the issuer. And they're able to validate that that is in fact their card, and the cryptogram helps them have some assurance that that is a valid card in the place. So that's why we're seeing such confidence and high approval rates when a contact chip and PIN transactions are done. Then we look at contactless chip data. We've moved to the point where we're now moving away from that mag stripe data alone to contactless chip data. So in other words, that is based on the same standards as the EMV contact chip. It's dynamic. It changes with every transaction, and it's not static. So that if it's captured somehow, it can't be reused. That data is used once, and it can't be reused for any other transactions within the contactless environment. So it's very, very secure based on chip standards. And then lastly, we look at the mobile phones, and we've seen such a growth, whether it be Apple Pay or Samsung Pay or Google Pay. All of these have come into our market over the last few years. And those are even more secure. Those are tokenized transactions. And when I say tokenized transactions, what I mean is that when the consumer enrolls and registers their card for Apple Pay, for example, what's been put on their phone is a token. It's not even their account number. It's a proxy number that is used to replace their account number. It is unique only to that device. If it's compromised, it can't be used anywhere else in any other device. And the beauty of a token is if the phone's lost, then you simply cancel the token. And the application where it's being used is relying on biometrics to activate it, so that even if a lost phone, it can't be used in any capacity because of the security around it. So it is a very secure transaction once it's provisioned onto a telephone. And those are dynamic as well too. They change with every transaction. So that tap of the phone at your merchant terminal is a very, very secure transaction. Some of the myths that we have around contactless payments is that they're not as secure. And when we look at this overall, as I mentioned, they are meeting the same standards as a contact chip. We still have some devices in market that are MSD and based on static data, but they're very small. They represent a small portion of our overall market, and we're continually trying to upgrade those merchant terminals to have them removed from the market for the most part. But again, these devices are basically built around EMV standards, including the mobile devices. When we look at them, the range that you can transmit a card is usually within 2 inches. So is it possible that somebody could walk behind you, tap your wallet that's in your back pocket, or tap your purse with some sort of reader and capture a read from the device? Yes, it's possible. But what can they do with it? That is one-time use, and it is dynamic. It changes with every transaction. So they will have a difficult time of replaying that data in any capacity. If they were to capture the account number and expiry date, they may be able to use it online. But we've now taken steps to require merchants in this market as of October of this upcoming year all to use the 3-digit code on the back, CVV2. So any merchant that's now requiring CV2, this data couldn't be used on their sites as well too, because with a contactless transaction, you're just capturing the account number and the expiry date. And as I mentioned, there is a unique code that's being generated each time with these transactions. And our network also looks at every transaction and analyzes it. So we've had some consumers that have had their cards stolen, and the fear is that they're going to just run up the contactless transactions. But issuers put rules in place, and each of these transactions have a floor limit. Most of them around $100 is what you can use these cards for. And issuers will say, okay, I've seen 3 or 4 transactions in a row that are all contactless within 2 hours. That's unusual. That's unlike the consumer's behavior. I'm going to make a phone call out to the consumer to ensure they still have their card in their possession. And because that's how the fraudsters can exploit potentially a contactless card. But you as a merchant, you're not liable for that. You're chip enabled, you're completing a chip transaction. That's an issuer liability that will bear the loss in event of a lost, stolen contactless card. The biggest thing is that the consumers love contactless. The merchants love contactless. If we look today, and this says 46.5, the last stats we saw for last month were 49% of our volume today for transactions under $100 are contactless. Consumers have embraced this. Merchants have embraced it because of the throughput. You got busy, you're in fast foods or your coffee, places where you have a high throughput of cardholders going through, you want that tap and go, tap and go, tap and go experience. And that's what contactless brings, whether it's with a card or whether it's a mobile phone device. Let's talk a little bit about fallback. And first of all, fallback, by definition, it's when an EMV chip card is presented at a chip reading device, a chip-enabled merchant, and the device is unable to complete this as a chip-read transaction. So it's completed some other way. The first way you would normally default to fallback is magstripe. The next way would be a manual key entry. And this occurs a couple different reasons. One, it's unintentional, so it could be a faulty chip or card, or there's a problem with the terminal itself, some sort of technical interoperability issue, or in some cases maybe even poor merchant practices. For whatever they're intentionally doing it this way. It's deliberate when a fraudster basically disables a chip card or creates a counterfeit card with a chip, what appears to be on a chip that's not functioning, and encodes the magstripe with compromised account data. Or it's poor data quality, such as a merchant terminal or whatever. But for the most part, we're really focused on, when we look at this from a fraud perspective, we see a higher incidence of fraud when a chip card is presented at a chip terminal and falls back to a magstripe transaction. So we've introduced a rule to start with that effective the 14th of April 2018, if an EMV chip card does not function properly as a chip-enabled merchant, the merchant attempts to process the transaction by swiping the magstripe, the issuer must decline the transaction. So come April, in about less than 3 weeks, the issuers will be declining fallback to magstripe. So what we see is in some cases there are merchants that have improperly configured terminals, unattended terminals. Parking example is one area that we saw a fair amount of fallback, and we've been working with all of the acquirers to address and correct these situations so that they're properly identified as being a magstripe only terminal. In other instances, unfortunately, we're seeing merchants like restaurants that we're seeing properly conducted chip transactions, but at the same time we're seeing a high volume of magstripe. And that may be a merchant that does not have a mobile terminal, a portable terminal to take to the table, and that they're intentionally causing the transaction to fall back to a magstripe so they can bring the receipt to the table and the waiter can get the appropriate tip that they want, and they're not going to miss out on it. So merchants are going to have to be very careful about their practices. If they've been doing this as common, come April they're going to be impacted, and they're going to have to change the way they do things. But if a card is falling back, as I mentioned, there's a high risk of fraud. You need to examine the security features on the card to ensure that it's a genuine. That's why that first slide was important as to what you should look for. Manual key is another option, but it's not something that's going to protect you. If you do a manual key, then you're obligated to take an imprint and to capture a signature on that imprint, or you're susceptible to a chargeback in the event of fraud. We don't recommend that manual key is a way that you should be looking at it. In fact, there's a lot of merchants that just simply won't do a manual key because it slows down the whole checkout process. Now they have to have an imprint machine underneath the counter as well too, and it just adds another layer to their acceptance. Forced posting. Forced posting is an issue that we've seen rear its head over the last couple of years, and a forced posting function is really out there today to allow a merchant to capture a sale in which a valid authorization was not obtained. In other words, say your power went out and you're a large retailer and you still want to maintain business, you're going to do your systems went down. Sorry, not your power, because that'd be you'd not be able to do anything then. But if your communication system lines went down, you still wanted to conduct transactions, you're going to move to a forced post mode. So you're actually completing the transaction and it's settling at the end of the day when the communication lines comes back up. And this, what we're seeing is the fraudsters are exploiting this. They're learning how to take your terminal, and by pressing certain function buttons on the face of the terminal, they're putting it into a forced post mode. You, unbeknownst to it, you don't see this happening. And a lot of times merchants are very polite. When a consumer grabs the terminal, they turn away and they don't even look at what they're doing because they don't want to see the PIN entry and things like this. And so the individual will be making multiple entries onto the terminal, put it into a forced post mode. Then it appears to authorize, and it appears to enter, print out a receipt. But on the receipt, it's going to be evident in certain ways that this is a forced posting and that this did not authorize. But merchants are not aware of it. The individual walks out the store with the goods, and it may be 3 months later before you get a chargeback and you realize that you were defrauded in this particular case. These are some examples of some receipts that would indicate a forced posting sale. And on the first one, starting on the left, a pre-auth completion, an advice, a forced sale, an offline sale. Again, in each of these cases, there was a receipt printed up. The individual signed. It says approved. It says approved on every one of them. I can understand why a merchant would be confused. So if you're a small shop, you should probably reach out to Moneris and understand whether you need to have forced postings or whether you want to have it on your terminals. Otherwise, you need to put some controls around it with a password that maybe the manager is the only one that can activate, because you really should be trying to restrict access in this particular case so that your terminal is not susceptible to compromise by an individual, by a consumer, touching the terminal when you think they're processing a transaction. If you don't need the forced sale functionality, then have it disabled if that's possible from your terminal. But again, the whole purpose of this in the past was around voice authorizations, referrals, prior authorization, or lost communication. But with our advances in technology today, we see less and less of a need for the forced post functionality. Everybody's pretty well online all the time. So let's talk a bit about terminal security and tampering. A lot of times what we see here is that within the physical point of sale environment, fraudsters are going to try to somehow get into your environment either with a collusive employee or unbeknownst to yourself that they're in that environment to capture account data. There's still value in even chip data, because chip data, unless the merchant is encrypting at the point of sale, which is a solution that Moneris offers, but unless you're not encrypting, then that data still is in the clear for the most part, which includes the account number and expiry date. So there's still value for the fraudster's point of view to capture some of that data and potentially try to use it in other channels, not so much the card presence channel. But the most common things that years ago were skimming devices, handheld ones. There are the two photographs on the very bottom there that we would have seen where they would have had to have a collusive merchant. So with almost a double swipe, a swipe through the terminal, a swipe through these devices. So if you see any of these in your merchant environment, this is what you should be alerted to and contact the authorities when you see this type of device. It's vital that you know how to spot it and what to look for. The other thing is terminal tampering, and this is much more difficult because what they'll do is they'll get into your environment, especially if you have multi-lanes. They'll distract you, or they'll wait to closing hours when there's very little staff on at that point in time, or look for a lane that's closed down at the time, pull out a terminal, put a dummy one in, come back the next day. In the meantime, within 24 hours, they've had the ability to modify the terminal so that it has the capability to capture the chip read or the mag stripe read and Bluetooth and pin entry and Bluetooth that information off to somebody sitting nearby in a parking lot to capture it. So it's really important that you look for obvious signs of tampering on your terminals. You protect your terminals from theft. Either they're bolted to the counters, or they're tethered with a strap, or at the end of the day, if you're in a food court area, for example, you put it out of sight, out of mind, so nobody can reach it, type of thing. And repairs of your devices should be controlled, and only authorized individuals coming in to repair your devices, and contact your acquirer immediately if you suspect something's wrong. You can be inspecting your devices on a regular basis. Record your serial numbers so you can look for those as well too. There's other ways of tampering that we've seen over the last little while, and one is on chip devices where they've actually inserted a device inside the terminal. And basically this was to capture chip data. So the card would still function as a normal transaction. This sort of sits like a man in the middle between the card and the read head of the terminal to capture this additional data as it flows through from the chip card to the terminal as they're communicating back and forth. And so you're capturing that PIN, you're capturing the account data as well too. And then they'll have to come back at some point in time, and the device on the bottom is a retrieval device so that they can retrieve all of this information from these terminals. Where we've discovered this is through either inspection, or sometimes these devices are poorly made, and the consumer puts his card in, and when he pulls the card out comes the shimming device at the same time, and he looks in amazement at what this is on the end of his card. And so, again, any of this is detected in your environment, you need to contact Moneris right away. You're not liable from a point of view of a merchant being, if your terminal's been compromised, Visa will not go after you as a merchant. You're as much a victim in this particular case as the consumers whose cards they're trying to compromise. So some preventive measures. One is replace your PEDs, your terminals, as quickly as possible as you see a challenge with them. Train your staff on what to look for. How do they inspect them? The seals, the serial numbers, any wiring, they should be looking at these, and that should be part of your regular startup each morning when you open your store up. And ensure your PEDs, your point-of-sale entry devices, I say PEDs, I'm sorry for the acronyms, are physically secured and locked down to the counters, either with a cradle or some sort of tether strap so that they can't be easily removed. And then look to see that, review your terminal usage best practices. We have something posted online on visa.com that's there for you to look on how you can best secure. But again, it's just diligence on your part to ensure that your terminals remain intact and they haven't been compromised in any way. When it comes to security, as I mentioned before, it's about inspecting daily, removing these PEDs that are suspected to have been compromised. Continue to safeguard your environment. For multi-lanes, that's your challenge. You're going to have lanes that are not always active. You need to be looking at them on a regular basis. And large merchants, you should really have an incident response plan when it comes to these compromised events should they take place. When you see and determine that it's been tampered with, contain and limit the exposure. Inspect as I said, you're inspecting your device on a daily basis. Remove the compromised device from the network and safeguard and secure it so that you can reach out to your acquirer, in this case Moneris, to be able to come in and replace it with a proper PED, and they will then do the forensics on the device to determine what is happening, because every time one of these devices is compromised, they look to see how was it done, how was it accomplished, and can we determine a pattern or a technique that's being used, and what can we learn from the actual compromise to better protect ourselves going forward here. We also have on visa.com what to do a compromised document, So it's available there also on visa.com for your reading pleasure. So let's talk a bit about data breaches as well too. So data breaches, when we look at data breaches, we look at merchants from different levels. And a level 1 is a merchant that processes more than 6 billion Visa transactions on an annual basis. A level 2 is anyone from 1 million to 6 million. A level 3 is any e-commerce merchant that's under 1 million. And a level 4, which most of our merchants fall into, are merchants that process less than 1 million Visa transactions on an annual basis. You can see that they are the low-hanging fruit. They are the choice of the fraudsters today. 84% of our breaches today are level 4 merchants. The small merchants are the prime targets. Why? Because they, in a lot of cases, they know how to make pizza, and they rely on somebody within the industry, a third-party integrator, to set up their terminal and set it up according to the payment card industry data security standards. And that reliance is on them to do it properly and to ensure that ongoing maintenance is done according to the standards. Or we see these integrators that connect to multiple thousands of merchants, and the fraudsters are now focusing and breaching these integrators and resellers. And once you breach them, you now breach thousands of potential merchants that they service. So it's very, very important that the level 4 merchants understand their service providers. Are they qualified? Are they a qualified integrator? Do they understand the program, and have they set up my environment according to the proper payment card industry standards? So who's being targeted here within this space? When we look at it, as I mentioned, it's small businesses. They're a large population with low or no security controls, and really what they have to do here is perform the basic securities. And as I mentioned, ensure they employ a qualified integrated reseller. The next category we're talking about is the integrated resellers, the ones that you as a merchant are relying on. They're frequently being targeted. They have improper, in some cases, point-of-sale implementations. And a lot of times, how do they service your environment? It's remotely. They don't come to your store. They get remote access in, and sometimes that remote access is left on. It's not turned on when they come in and then turned off after they leave. Or it's the same passwords are being used for across all 100 stores within your chain. So if I breach one, I'm now into all 100 stores because I have the same password. So you have to ensure that your integrator that you're using is a qualified integrator reseller, and that they are complying with the payment card industry data security standards and the payment application data security standards. We also see the other area that's most commonly breached today is the hospitality industry, and that's your hotels. And there's still a strong reliance on magstripe data within the hotel sector, even 8 years after our migration to EMV chip. So it's still being a highly sought commodity is the magstripe data that they're going after. So they still are the target of it. So we put some requirements out that in our market here by 2020, all merchants in Canada must be EMV enabled. That's a requirement that's out there today. Hopefully this is the way to move forward with the hospitality sector, which is one of the last industry segments to adopt chip and PIN. So small merchant basics. When we look at this here as a protecting the card, you really have to look at protecting the card. And whether that's moving to EMV chip is one way to do that, because you now as a dynamic transaction each time. If you store account data, and this is probably more applicable to card not present merchants, but if you store card not present data, you should be looking at tokenizing that. If I've got 1 million accounts sitting on file, the last thing I want is a fraudster to get into my network, have access to 1 million accounts, and now I'm on the front page of tomorrow's newspaper as being a breached entity. And what impact does that have to your brand as a result? You need to be tokenizing transactions if you're storing any account data. Or even as a merchant today at card present, if you're storing account data for follow-up or customer service or returns, you've got to ensure that that's properly secured, either truncated, where you don't have the full account number, or it's being tokenized in some manner. You also can look, it's very basic, it's change passwords. Everybody is annoyed with it. I don't like it myself Well, my organization every 30 days has me changing my password. But it's all around protecting our environment. And you have to have a strong password. Too many people have password as their password, 1234 is their password, or a simple name as their password. It's got to be something that's a strong password, difficult to guess. I know it's very difficult to try to maintain multiple passwords, and you should be changing it on a regular basis. You definitely have to eliminate default passwords on your point of sale terminals that have been set up by your vendor. That has to be changed the moment a new terminal gets put in. And do not share passwords. Every employee that has access to your system should have a unique password. If you have 5 stores, access to each of those stores should have 5 different passwords when it gets to the remote access to your network. It's just common sense. That's something easy for you to maintain and manage. Don't give hackers easy access to your network is the next one. Most of the breaches we've seen today is because of remote access, and it's been left on, and it's easily accessed by these fraudsters. So basically, you have to find out if your vendor server or servicer that services your point of sale terminal is using remote access, and how do you limit that? Are you using any sort of two-factor or multi-factor authentication? Is it simply a password? Because that's something static that can be compromised easy enough and reused. But if it's requiring a fob, for example, and a dynamic password that changes with every entry, then that's even more challenging for somebody to be able to get into your network. Ensure that your vendor servers have unique credentials for each store location. It's not the same one across your entire line of stores. And ask for your vendor or servicer for help or your acquirer when it comes to this particular area. Vendor patches is the next area that we can look at. And it's simple enough. We've seen a lot of breaches that could have been avoided had the vendor or the merchant implemented a patch that came out 2 months earlier. And the reason for the patch is there has been a known vulnerability that the vendor manufacturer or programmer has identified, and they've developed this or written this patch to address that vulnerability. So the fact that this is released and 2 months later you're getting around to it or you haven't done it yet, that puts you at risk. So please, patches are simple to do. Put them out as quickly as possible as soon as it's done. So this just gives you some of these things. When they talk about security, they go, oh my goodness, it's a huge cost or an effort to do these. Some of them are very simple. So this chart here breaks it down: ease of implementation, cost, and effectiveness. And when you look at changing default passwords, low ease of implementation, no cost, and effectiveness medium. So you look across the board here: antivirus, ease of implementation, medium, cost, medium. Enable remote access. It's a low implementation and a low cost. All these ones that are low and no cost, you should be on top of these ones right away and use them within your environment today to further protect yourself. And the last one in the end there, employee training and awareness. Everybody has a part to play in this. We get constant phishing awareness training to us. One of the ways that they get into your network a lot of times is a phishing email to an executive or somebody who clicks on the attachment, and now you've allowed somebody into your environment. And once they're inside, they do their reconnaissance, and they may spend weeks or months before they actually commit or get to a payment area. But it's important that you constantly have training with your employees how to look at phishing emails and how to protect themselves and how to respond when they suspect something is coming from an inappropriate source. So lastly, I want to talk a bit about Visa's strategy here. Our strategy can really be broken down into 4 pillars. It's around protecting data, devaluing data, harnessing it, or empowering consumers. And what we've learned over the years within the payment business, that security must be a multi-layered approach. It's not just one focus, and that goes for a merchant too. We don't propose that a merchant should have one tool and that's where they put all their eggs in their basket. It's a multi-layered approach to managing security. It's a tool and fraud mitigation strategies and on and on and on. But these 4 multi-layers are 4 pillars to really help manage the payment system. When we look at protecting data, if we go back 10 years when mass data breaches started happening, we started to focus heavily on protecting data. The payment card industry data security standards are foundational for this. But when you have potentially 20 billion endpoints that can be potentially compromised, it's a much more complex approach, and you're trying to manage it, and especially when you get down to our largest number of merchants being the level 4 merchants. It's even more challenging trying to manage that space. So we look at ways that we can devalue data, and what I mean there is, how do you make that data useless? So if it gets compromised, it can't be reused, or it has little or no value to the fraudsters. And that's what we're trying to do in a lot of, that's what EMV chip is all about. Taking that, what used to be static magstripe data that I could capture off a magstripe or during a transaction and put right onto another magstripe and reuse it, and I wouldn't be able to tell whether that was a genuine card or whether that was a counterfeit card. So moving to EMV creates dynamic data that changes with every transaction and makes it difficult for a fraudster to reuse if that data is compromised within the contact chip environment. It's almost impossible. And so we can say the same thing for tokenization within either your card present or card not present space. If you've taken that account number and replaced it with a proxy number that's unique to that environment, it can't be used anywhere else. It's useless to a fraudster if they get it. So that's really what we're focusing on. Harnessing data is much more what we're looking at today is how do we take this proliferation of data and connection points that in some ways creates risks to the Visa enterprise, but on the other hand, it's really our answer. It's our answer to the problem here, is that it's all this data, it's going to power intelligence, our ability to identify what we believe to be a suspicious transaction, identify what we believe to be a compromised merchant, and be able to mitigate it before the fraud occurs and stop that transaction. And then lastly, we don't want to overlook the consumers. They have a role to play. Everybody has a role to play in this. And we've recently put out another rule change come this October that all issuers have to offer an alert service to consumers. I have an alert service on my mobile phone. Every time one of my cards is used, I get an SMS text message to me telling me the transactions occurred at this date and time. And I've had fraud on my account. I've been on the GO train heading home and have a transaction happening at a gas station in Mississauga, and it's not, no way it's me, it's not possible. And I stop, alert my issuer who cancels my card. The next day a transaction occurs again at the same merchant at the same time, and it's declined this time, only because I was empowered to that. That could have went on for a month at least, without me looking at my statement, and that would not be deemed an unusual transaction once a day. So we think there's a lot that consumers can do to be part of the process as well too. When we look at our multi-layer security within counterfeit, card not present, and lost stolen, the counterfeit side we've got encryption, which is a possibility at the point of sale to further encrypt. We have real-time predictive analytics across all these fraud types. Within counterfeit, it's really chip and PIN in our market has reduced domestic counterfeit to less than 1 basis points today, what we're seeing. It's tremendous, the impact that it's had on fraud at the point of sale. Tokenization, as it's evolving here, and we're going to hear a lot more of this over the next few years, is really, I think, where we have to go within the card not present and any sort of credential or stored account data is tokenizing it in the future. And PIN is another way of further reducing fraud when it comes to lost and stolen. So a card that's lost and stolen, that PIN provides another layer of cardholder verification that only the consumer knows. So again, this is a multi-layered approach. We're not using just chip to say that's our answer to fraud. We're looking across all these different channels and how do we have multi-layers of protection here. When we look at data, as I mentioned already once before, data is the target, but we think it's also our answer here. You know, when we look at our network, it brings advanced analytics to every transaction in real time. Whenever Visa processes a transaction, we're able to apply this artificial intelligence, analyzing up to about 500 data points to apply a risk score within milliseconds of the transaction. And long before machine learning was a buzzword, we built this one-of-a-kind intelligence network to look for fraud patterns, And we're scoring every transaction today, and every issuer in Canada is receiving this score with every single transaction they conduct. And they can make that determination of what is a risky transaction or not. But we're also applying this intelligence to spot and stop compromises, which should be very interesting from a merchant perspective. In a lot of ways, we see the cyber threat intelligence, and we know how the attackers are motivated. They're looking for account data. That's what they're after. And a lot of times when we see a breach, we analyze every single breach to look at, after a forensic report, to look to see how did they get into the environment, how did they exfiltrate the data, and where did it go to. And a lot of times there are these malicious servers where all this data comes in. So we've started looking at these servers and where are the merchant connection points? Why are all these thousands of merchants connecting to this server, going out to the servers, to their websites, and we're seeing malware on their websites. And so now that's before fraud has even happened, before it's even been reported. We're now reaching out to these acquirers and their merchants and saying, go to this, rather than a needle in a haystack saying you've been breached, we're now going to them and say, here's where we're seeing this malware, here's the malware that's on your website, and here's where you can find it. Please remove it. So we're trying to use this intelligence as a way to be more proactive in analyzing cyber intelligence threat that's out there. So in the future, we look at this, what do you have, present today, what do you have? You have a card, you have chip, you have a mobile device, and it's what you know, whether it be a password, a PIN, address, or security questions. What we see in the future is the who, what, and where are going to be biometrics. You're seeing that the first foray into it with the mobile devices, where the biometrics are now being used in some cases as a way to authenticate yourself when you do an in-app transaction, for example, or to authenticate yourself before you tap your phone. The physical location, we can take that device and say the consumer is in Toronto today, and this transaction is occurring in Toronto. That's very low risk. But if the consumer is in Toronto with his device, yet the transaction is a physical transaction in Vancouver, then that's going to affect the scoring of that transaction. We can look at purchase behavior, how you normally purchase, what's outside your normal pattern, and score it. And we'll look at the contextual data as well too. So all of this information is where we're moving in the future when it comes to further analyzing this information. We have, I mentioned a couple mandates, and I mentioned throughout. One was devalue data, and 100% of chip EMV transactions at the point of sale by 2020 will need to be EMV, 100% EMV chip. And by 2022, all the unattended devices, like parking devices, anything that's unattended that accepts a card, will have to be chip enabled as well by 2022. This is all about moving the environment forward to further secure it, and it's creating a consistent consumer experience as well. Interact today on the debit side within Canada, everything must be chip enabled. So we're creating that consistent experience across the board. So the key takeaways that we have here in conclusion, and I'm within 2 minutes, so first of all, security must be multi-layered. You can't rely on a single effort. Criminals are very sophisticated and agile, and will look for the low-hanging fruit. And if there's money to be made, they'll try to find that weak link. And they'll move to card not present from the card present channel, or if they see an exploit available within the card present space, they will do so. You can't protect everything. So if you don't need account data on file and you're not tokenizing it, don't store it. That's a simple way to avoid it. Just don't store it if you don't need it. It just leaves yourself a target for the most part if you keep this data on hand within your environment. Data is the target, but it's also the solution. So we're going to try to use the intelligence that we have flowing through our system to better identify opportunities that would suggest that this is a fraud transaction, or to better protect the environment, or to look at where potentially data breaches are in the future. And lastly, collaboration really remains the key. The data intelligence are only as good as how timely we can share it with our partners, whether it be the acquirers or the issuers or the merchants. And cooperation is important because none of us are going to solve this on our own. We really need to work together on this. So thank you very much. I think we are almost at our time. We're